actually see any members of the public here yet. But
And do we have... Oh, we don't have any attendees.
right.
Okay. Um, I was just
Sure.
looking at the council discussed the overlay, and I didn't see that. I didn't attend that, but I wanted to find out whether it's yet available as a recorded session, or if not, when will it be?
Um, Typically the meetings get posted on on Fridays to the town's YouTube channel. Sometimes it's a little delayed, but I think if we wanted, I could just make sure that, this is the Housing and Zoning Subcommittee of December 18th. I think we should just do a roll call attendance just to
Okay.
make sure everyone's here. Angus,
Present.
Fred,
Present, present.
great. Bruce,
Yeah.
all right. There's no attendees at this time.
All right.
Yeah,
Um,
for the agenda, we have no minutes. I don't know if there's any announcements from anyone.
not that I can think of. Fred, have you got anything to promote?
Not
Um,
particularly.
uh, Nate, do you have items that you would like us to deal with?
No, I mean the two items I had, shared with Jesse, and I thought I'd emailed this out, maybe I didn't, was just kind of discussion of the housing production plan and general zoning again, and then, any further discussion from the citizen petitions. And I think, we had discussed at the last meeting, the 40Y and some of the other priorities. We could talk about those. I don't, have not anything in particular. I think I was just at a functional area meeting with the second floor, and just in light of the planning board, and we just talked about it last night a bit in terms of being ambitious, but I think it's worth it. So, this morning I was looking at the PRP zoning and looking at what kind of uses could go there, um, in terms of say allowing housing. And so, it's something that the planning board's discussed, staff's discussed, and so, it's like, do we allow apartments, mixed use buildings, and hotels or motels, or or what are the other uses? The PRP zoning's been in place for a while, and we've heard from a few owners that you know, they don't, there's just not a lot happening there. And so, for instance, it seems like, oh, that could be something that's easy, and it's just isolated to the PRP zone, so it'd just be allowing some new uses there in addition to what's already allowed. Um, I say that, but I know it always gets more complicated, you know, but that's something that, for instance, if I think it's a good priority, and so I'd like to, you know, staffs would like to move that forward, and I can always bring it back here. But that's something I'm working on.
Okay. Is that so we can put that up? Anything else? The we discussed the I can't remember the 40 wide discussion happened at the last
Right.
um, subcommittee, or was it a planning board meeting?
Yeah, the subcommittee.
Yeah, because I think Angus, you said that you had looked at that, and subsequently I read it. Do we do?
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that's still worth talking about. To
yeah. Well, let's concentrate on those two things um, uh, for the for this meeting, and unless there's anything else that is. Um, so, Angus, what have you got?
Yeah, I guess one of the questions I have that I was thinking about, I was reading in the paper about the new planning director said something about PRP.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask, so there's essentially I think there's three PRP zones in town, right? One is off Old Belchertown Road in South Amherst. The other one is off Route 9, close to the Hadley border, just below the North Amherst overlay. And then the other one is far north, in on the way to Sunderland. I guess I'm wondering, Nate, the planning director mentioned possibly like rezoning some of that to light industrial, for instance. Um, so I guess one question I have is those are certainly the North Amherst and the South Amherst one are pretty big chunks of land that both have a bunch of wetland issues. Um, the one off of Route 9 seems actually pretty developed already, or somewhat more. It doesn't have as much open space as the other two. And I guess I just wanted to ask, um, you as the kind of town and the planning department as a whole, we could change the PRP to allow for housing, for instance. Um, at the same time, the PRP and frankly the OP zoning designations are not doing what they're supposed to do. They haven't ever done what they're supposed to do, and it seems like they're not going to because both are kind of predicated on office space and kind of a research park model that seems like it doesn't really make sense for a town like this. So I guess I'm wondering, we on the one hand, we could open up those zones to more options, right? The other option is we could change the zone, and I'm thinking about this in particular with the North Amherst one. That's a big chunk of land. On the one hand, zoning to light industrial would promote that kind of use. On the other hand, we also said in thinking about 40Y or 40R, there's not a ton of giant, big old parcels out there that we could potentially zone for those things. That North Amherst one is a pretty big chunk. So, I mean, does the planning department have any preferences in thinking about PRP and OP, and or is it our job to set those preferences, and who cares what the planning department thinks?
Yeah, I don't think there's any preferences yet, and I
Okay.
think um, you're right that the different PRP zones could be, changed individually, right? So, although I said, oh, we could make an overlay over them, maybe we just focus on housing on the one off Belchertown Road near Larkspur Drive.
Yeah.
And that, and then the one in North Amherst, we look at it for it could be something else. I will say the one in North Amherst there's a solar field on one already, existing solar. And all the PRP, even the one off Belchertown Road, does have a lot of wetlands. So I think kind of what the property can actually, what the capacity of that land is might not be as great as what it looks like on the map. So, if you look at North Amherst, you're like, ooh, wow, this looks like there's 50 acres. There might only be, you know, 20 acres that are easily accessible and developable. But yeah, I think, for instance, the one off Larkspur Drive, we've heard, the town's heard from a number of owners and, even prospective developers, buyers, and they've asked like, oh, what could happen there? And often they might want to do some residential or a mix of something, even mixed use buildings. And right now that's not allowed in the PRP. And I agree, you could change the zoning altogether. The idea of the overlay, though, is that anything that the PRP allows now could still be allowed. And so not totally shutting the door on, say research and development facilities or something. Um, so yeah, I guess the question is they are somewhat um, they're not quite in village center. So, the idea, for instance, is if we said, oh, let's make it, we want to have some kind of development, is it like, oh, is it now BVC? And is that really the right zone? Whereas an overlay, we could say the overlay is really only for these three uses and it's really narrow so that, or one use or something. And, that's, it's something that staff's been looking at more, say the Belchertown Road one for housing. I think the idea that others might be zoned differently in North Amherst, maybe it is light industrial or something. But I think, the housing production plan consultant also said, wow, there's, I don't know if it was exactly in the plan, but when, as through meetings and as they just, toured the town, they said, oh, what are these, right? What are some of these zones, right? Like, oh, the PRP, they totally understood what it was, but right, is it really serving its intended purpose, or is there ways to now update it and modify it? And so it's just interesting to have someone else also point it out, and maybe other people think maybe there's other ideas what could happen with the PRP, but the idea right now is could there be some housing uses or some mixed use allowed? Um,
Um, Angus, you want to follow up?
I mean, I guess um, I the personally I don't see them as all that useful. Um, and I think the at a minimum the North Amherst location, um, I mean it's like almost entirely a floodplain. At least that's what it looks like on the map. I don't know if I'm off on that. But it looks like it's a FEMA floodplain runs through about half of that property, and then the road runs through the other another portion. Um, so if I were building a professional research park, I wouldn't put it there. Um, it's also very close to a pretty dense set of housing, shopping. Like that's a very there's a lot of development happening right around that is the Mill River or whatever it's called.
Mill District.
Mill District. So there is possibility there. And I think it makes more sense to think of some kind of greater development there than light industrial, right? Since it's right adjacent to that. Um, but I guess to me, I was thinking of having another meeting with I met with Ron Lavardiere, who owns the Amherst Office Park. And I was
In
thinking of
South Amherst.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think the PRP, some portion of the PRP office park in off Belchertown Road.
Hmm.
So I was thinking of having a meeting with him to kind of get more information about what would be useful. I mean, he said that the office park in PRP is not a useful designation for his properties or as he's thinking about development, and that it's only an obstacle. Um, I don't know if Nate, there are other property owners of the North Amherst parcel or the PRP parcels off of Route 9 that would be worth talking to. But I'd be happy to like talk with some of these people to get a sense of whether they think it would be more helpful to say just open up PRP or OP to more uses, or if it would be more helpful to actually do a zoning redesignation or to do an overlay on top of them.
yeah, I mean, I think from, staff's met with a few owners and representatives, and they've all
Okay.
kind of said what Ron, but they kind of, Ron was one of the folks we've heard from, and he said the same thing, right? That he's eager to actually do something, and he's been kind of stymied by the zoning, and he's even said that the existing development off the Empress Office Park 2, or however we call it, in the PRP, that in the last so many years the tenants have changed, and what it was even built for, and they're not that old. It's been changing. So even like 19 Research Drive has undergone a lot of changes, say in 20 years, in terms of the ability to fill it with what, then it kind of what they thought would be there. And so, and I'm not sure the reason for that. There's, bigger market trends, right, in terms of say remote work or where people are working or how they do work. And so, um, there's still offices there, but at one point say it was a 15-person office, and now I think it's like there's a few people because, you know, I think the company still might have the employees, but they're not all coming into the office on such a regular basis. And so, um, I still like the idea of the overlay. I feel like what would be difficult would be to say, well, what, I guess we could look at it, but what zone replaces the PRP? And so I still think the uses in the PRP still might be able to come to town. And the idea would be, well, could we offer a few more? Um,
Could I make a strong push to instead of doing an overlay, just changing the PRP then? Because I feel like adding, or is that what you're saying when you say
No,
overlay, Nate?
I'm saying an overlay. So we'd have like, in this one PRP zone, we would
Yeah,
now, the overlay would be say for whatever we want to say, like say residential development. And then
yeah.
we'd allow a one or a few types of residential uses there, yeah, as opposed to rezoning the PRP to like RN or something.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I mean, 40, 30 or so years ago when we were talking about these creating these zones seemed to be important. The conversation was more focused on uh, creating a more robust tax base than it is now, where it's focused on housing. And prior to that, as I've said, it was focused on open space in the 70s and 80s. So the primary um, the consciousness shifts. So in the 90s, when there was a sense that we wanted to enhance the tax base, and having these uh, opportunities were important, and they were somewhat cherished and so forth. But I think when you look back and you say, well, we've had 30 years, and there's been, at least on North Amherst, there's been an attempt, one attempt to use that parcel or that zone for its intended purpose. And it founded on the extent of wetlands and so forth. And as you noted, Angus, and the part of that site that is essentially upland in North Amherst is pushed over toward the residential end. You know, it's not on the at the side of the property where it would be most logical from a purely planning common sense point of view, which would be say push the buildings close to the road so you can get in and out quickly. Well, that's where the water is. That's where the wetlands is, and so you're pushing the development area to the opposite side of the parcel, to the eastern side, most remote from the Sunderland Road, and you've got to cross a stream in order to get there. So it doesn't seem to be it's not delivering. And so I probably personally would think, well, we've given it a chance. I think we shouldn't discount eliminate the zoning that's there, so we shouldn't discount the future possibility that something could happen there, and God knows how many in the future. But I'm now persuaded that opening up to housing, which is something that is currently the perceived as the important thing to be providing in town. I think that's an argument that I could support.
So there's just a couple of, I guess, things that we probably have to talk about. In addition to changing, we'd have to change the dimensional regulations if we wanted to open up to housing.
yes,
Okay. In addition to obviously changing the uses that are allowed.
right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, sometimes when we've done an overlay like University Drive, it's a specific section in the zoning bylaw. And other times you can do an overlay, but then you just change pieces within the existing bylaw. And then you call it out, in section 3 in our zoning bylaw, we'd say, okay, now here's this new zoning district. And we can reference the sections, but essentially, we wouldn't, we would change the use table, the dimensional table in a few spaces, but it wouldn't be like it's, section 18 is now the PRP overlay. It could be embedded within what was already the structure of the bylaw. And so, mixed use buildings become a site plan review instead of a no, right? And it could be
Right.
like, I think hotels and motels, maybe that's an interesting one because that becomes a site plan review. And we can always change it or add conditions or something, but
Sure.
I was thinking about it kind of in that way as opposed to developing a kind of a whole new set of um, like a whole separate overlay kind of section of the
Yeah.
bylaw. But
Okay.
yeah, and um, yeah, so I know you mentioned the 40Y. I mean, I'd be curious, Bruce, to see what you think. I've done a little bit more reading on 40Y. What we've heard um, from one person is that the cost of infrastructure and getting a site to be developable is so expensive that they weren't sure that even like a 5,000 square foot lots would work. And so, and and it's always interesting like how much do you rely on that? There it seems like most people like a multi-unit building, right? Like whatever it is, like some apartment kind of style building, as opposed to say really small lots that could have single family homes to duplexes or triplexes. And so just because the infrastructure costs like to actually build out that neighborhood is so expensive that it's not something people are inclined to do. They'd rather do, you know, a multi-unit development. So I don't know. I mean, I still think 40Y is interesting. But I'd be curious to know what others think if we want to have an area in town and kind of develop it and see if we could try to do that.
Well, it seemed that when I read through that, and I did it a week or so ago, so um, uh, but it's a state enabling legislation, right?
Right.
And there are quite a few seemingly somewhat draconian provisions that you need to, or bases you need to touch in order to um, legitimate to be a legitimate candidate. And it seemed to be pretty onerous. And I was wondering whether we couldn't, whether it's possible to extract the some of the beneficial provisions from that 40Y concept and enshrine them in um, that's probably a separate additional article of our zoning bylaw where we just allowed it without having to use the state enabling legislation. Um, is that a fatally flawed idea, or is it? What's wrong with approaching it that way? What's wrong with trying
Uh,
to get a
right.
solution somewhat like Mansfield example that you uh, showed us without
Right.
having to go through the 40 tunnel, but just do it ourselves?
No, I think the building commissioner, Bruce, had the same thoughts,
Uh-huh.
that the 40Y to get a 40Y adopted, there's a lot of steps and a lot of kind of control or checkpoints with the state. I guess what the 40Y does allow is it caps the size of homes in terms of square feet and bedrooms, which is something typically zoning can't do. Um, but I think a lot of the other provisions could just be changed in our zoning. I think, you know, maybe communities are excited by the fact that if they take what is a low density area and then they say we can triple or quadruple the density, they get this one time, they get a payment, right? They get I don't know if it's $1,000 or $2,000 an extra extra property. And so I don't know if that's enough of an enticement, but um, no, I agree. I think there's probably pieces of it we could extract and then say, do we apply it in a certain zone? And what I guess, but maybe the other thing is as an overlay or however people are implementing it, it's really site specific or small in terms of its geographic area. So it's like, okay, well, in this area where we'll allow really small lots and have some control, but that it doesn't change, say, for all their, say outlying residential district, they're not saying now let's have 5,000 square foot lots. It's only in this one small area. So
Yeah.
I think that's the
What?
benefit. I haven't figured out what's the right approach, but I,
Hmm.
I kind of had your similar thought.
Well,
Um,
what I remember, say, for example, with the farmland protection overlay, which obligates a developer in those overlay zones to deploy the cluster approach. So the building sites are half as big. And that happened in the Bukowski parcel in the about 20 plus years ago, which is up here in North Amherst. It's an old farm that's about a mile long and about 300 feet wide, or that's what it was. And ultimately, the bylaw prevailed, and the developer, Jones Patterson, um, did concentrate the 18 odd houses that were entitled to cross the full extent of the parcel into about a third or or so of the eastern end of the parcel, and they were done according to cluster. But the houses that arrived there were just as big as they would have been if they were on lots twice as big. So as you say, um, there is a tendency to build the house. You can make small lots, but people will. There's nothing. Apparently, we can't or didn't successfully restrict the size of the houses, so they look a little bit odd. I'm kind of getting used to it, but still, it would be nice to be able to, because if the 40Y lots would be, I don't know, half or a third the size of those lots that are created in the Owen Drive area as a part of that clustered concentration of the farmland protection overlay. Um, and so if you were to make sites that were, maybe it could be a condition, or if we took a parcel, let's just say, for example, the parcel that I was talking about that's on the north side of the cemetery on East Pleasant Street. There's a farmland there
Right,
which I
right.
think extends through into the forest and goes up to the railway tracks. I think it's quite a big parcel and that's undeveloped. Um, if we could identify a parcel or parcels, a few parcels like that, and then say that this overlay applies to these specific parcels, and in return for allowing a developer to build 5 times as many or multiple times as many, create multiple times as many lots in the subdivision as they would otherwise be able to do, that they agree to restrict the size of the units that they construct. And that that wouldn't be a taking. I don't know if taking even comes into this, but I would imagine that someone might say that the reason you can't restrict the size of a building that someone can build is that's kind of a somehow depriving them of potential revenue, potential profits, however way it's construed, it's ultimately becomes a taking. But there is a giving associated with that taking, and that is you can build twice or 3 times the number of houses more, but you can only build them a certain size. Do you think that that logic would um, stand the test of a land court or something like that?
And as I see your hand, yeah, it's interesting, Bruce. I feel like when the ADU legislation came out, I read a number of state, reviews of town meeting articles, and they're like, oh, here's what zoning shouldn't do, and blah, blah, blah. And then the 40Y is doing things probably because it's from the state and they say they can, right, getting down to the size of units. But I like I like what you're saying, and it's like, right, that one property I was just looking at, it's like, almost 20 acres. And it's like, okay, well, you know, is this a place to have, allow a really narrow subdivision road, like an 18-foot road and really small lots and create a neighborhood of 20 homes as opposed to, having 4 lots on it, given our
Yeah.
zoning or whatever it ends up being, like maybe one frontage lot and 2 flag lots or something on 20 acres. So I think it's worth looking into and maybe, right, identifying a few. So, one developer, was some stakeholder meetings, a developer kind of said this, was like, oh, some communities are looking at, or it was like a workshop about housing, and someone said, oh, some communities are looking at, just like you mentioned, a few properties, coming up with a 40Y or similar 40Y standards, and then applying it to these, it's their, they're not contiguous necessarily properties, but around a town, saying, here's, we actually want almost like traditional neighborhood development. We want,
Mm,
and
yeah.
so to me, it's like that property you mentioned, and maybe a few others become this other type of overlay or this other type of development method that we
Yeah.
would want to. Yeah.
Candidates.
Yeah.
Who owns that parcel? Can you tell me since you have it up?
I think yeah, hold on 1 minute. It's coming up as an LLC.
Okay.
So I don't, yeah,
Somebody waiting for an opportunity, perhaps. It sounds well. Anyway,
right.
that's a parcel that I've had in my mind for this kind of use for a while, because I drive by it Anytime I'm coming into town, I drive by it, so that's often. Um,
Bruce, what
Angus,
parcel? What's the parcel?
it's on the north side of the north of the cemetery, which is on East Pleasant Street. It's the cemetery. I'm not sure what the name of the cemetery is, but it's midway down East Pleasant Street. It's on the east side of East Pleasant Street, and then immediately north of that cemetery is a long parcel that extends from East Pleasant Street, I think, into the woodlands and probably all the way to the railway line. So it's and Nate who's just looked at it says it's about 20 acres. So it's I knew it was big. 20 acres is, yeah, perhaps a little bigger than I thought it might be, but that's a substantial amount of land. And the Barkowski parcel was probably about 30 acres, and that yielded 18 units, or maybe 16. So that's 2 acre or so. And so this one could probably, if we apply that crude rule of thumb and speculative guessing on the numbers, that's 10 units. But if it could be 50 units instead, by having small lots and maybe having zero lot lines and things like that, and probably requiring a park or two or some open space that could be integrated, because it's got a fairly long east-west axis and a fairly narrow north-south axis.
Right.
Right? So it's it just seemed like a good uh, lot to test out the hype, as a kind of a prototype the whole idea on, and then also see are there other lots similarly uh, available. I don't think there's probably wetlands in and around. There seems to be wetlands wherever you look, so I guess we can't expect that there, but it's not obviously wet.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think the thing that I I am with, I think, both of you in your beginning comments saying that 40Y does seem like a lot of work, a very heavy lift. Just looking at the Mansfield documents, it's remarkable, and it's for a single parcel. I mean, it's a big parcel, but it's not insanely huge. I mean, it sounds like it might be comparable to the parcel y'all are talking about, maybe a little bigger. But it feels like it's maybe worth looking into longer term if we can find a landowner or a developer who's interested in it. But it just feels like an enormous amount of work for the North Amherst overlay is a hypothetical. Nobody may take advantage of it, but it's not. We're replicating an already existing overlay, right? Making tweaks to fit the site, and then it's just wait and see, right? Like the PRP and the OP, does anything happen or not? And if it doesn't, then we revisit. But the 40Y thing is an enormous amount of work or potentially very little gain. So I'd be inclined to. I like this idea, Bruce, of maybe targeting one place and thinking about and testing the waters to see if people would be interested.
Yeah, it's just doing I mean, even taking some time to do I don't know, with the planning students, or how public to go with this, but to have somebody look at solution concepts around this idea on a given lot. Nate?
Yeah, as you're speaking, Bruce and Angus, I was writing, right, like what are kind of the benefits of say 40Y? And I think what the state is hoping, right, that it's kind of a fee simple ownership. So it's not a development method per se, like a PERD or a I mean, it could be like a cluster, but I think they're even trying
It's
to get down.
essentially a subdivision,
It is
basically.
right. It's really a subdivision with
Yeah,
really small lots.
yeah,
And
that's the way I'm thinking of it.
yeah, yeah. But I like the idea of fee simple. I think, Doug and the planning board's kind of talked about like, oh, is there a way to try to encourage, say, home ownership or a different type of kind of end user? And is it right through something like that that is like you could allow small lots and zero lot lines? And is it just with that, if that was taken advantage of, does it attract, say, a different kind of owner, buyer, renter, whatever, than say like a multi-unit apartment building? Like, we could say, oh, this we could allow, this is either could be a 20 lot subdivision, small lots, or a 20 unit apartment building. I think the who would move in and live there might be different between the two. And so that's why I don't know. I was writing down kind of like what are the benefits of 40Y and what kind of what the purpose was from the state. And but yeah, no, I like that idea. I feel like we should probably identify. I think there's maybe a few other properties I can think of where this would be an interesting approach, whether we call it a 40Y or 40Y-ish. I don't, but
Uh,
the idea of a
well,
new,
yes, would be good to come up with our name for
right,
it. One of my early mentors said you should always name your children. So if you're generating some idea,
right,
the notion was that you should brand it, certainly try before others do, because they may not have the same benevolent
right,
interests.
right,
So we should find a nice name for this, or at least a good functioning name rather than a series of, prototype number three or something.
right.
Um,
And I think, yeah, I-
like, I mean, uh, missing middle housing.
right. 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 And so I guess what I was gonna say is that what's different than this is say, consultants for the housing production plan mentioned, cottage style development, which to me
Yeah,
this is too big of a property, but to me that it could be really small lots, but it gets really tricky in terms of how do you configure those. To me, that's more almost like allowing multiple units on a property that are then kind of minimized if say there were different types of ownership. And so,
yeah. But I mean,
taking like
so long as you have a subdivision road that goes in and
yep,
so forth and comes back, and as you say, maybe for this kind of cottage style subdivision,
yep,
let's say that's it. That's we call it
right,
cottage
yep,
style subdivision.
right,
That that there's a book from 30 years ago in Davis, California, Village Homes. That's Michael Corbett. Michael Corbett,
yep,
Village
okay,
Homes. And Corbett and his wife Judy developed this Village Homes in Davis, and they did all sorts of things that were difficult at the time, which seemed purely logical, like narrower streets. They curved streets. They put trees there. Um, and village homes would probably still, even 30 years later, be a good functional prototype for this. So we would try and with our cottage style subdivision prototype or whatever overlay, cottage style subdivision overlays that
yep,
we enable a specific number of attributes, smaller streets and so forth, of course, and smaller lots, smaller frontages, zero lot lines.
right,
We might ask that there for every certain number of lots created, there be open space, a pocket park
right,
of a certain size, which maybe is 20% of the size of the lots, or we could figure out what the formula is or what. But basically, the object would be distribute for every 5 or 10 houses. There's a small park that comes along, um, and things like that that we could use as descriptors of this. And as you say, I like the idea, like the notion that we were talking about last night where maybe we get into the habit of um, developing these ideas in in schematic or conceptual um, to a limited level of sophistication, so that the idea is clear, and then we send it to the zoning board. Sorry, then to the town council. And because you're right, we're not asking the council to vote to approve, we're asking the town council to vote to refer it back to us and to the sibling committee, which is the CRC. So we only have to get the council interested enough to say this is worth pursuing. So I think that we should think about developing these ideas with that goal in mind, not thinking about how we have to touch every T and I in order to get them approved. And I think that'll mean that we only spend 10 or 15% of our time outlining these solution concepts, these schematic propositions for uh, zoning improvement or what have you. And then we send them to the council, and we could we could produce a lot more of these propositions to the council if we approach it that way, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and also I guess I think some counselors, we can always put more into it if they want it. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think, the university drive took a long time, and then by the time when the planning board discussed it and went to council, then we spent a lot more time talking about it as an official zoning amendment. So I think we could have a framework for zoning, have things filled out, and have these concept ideas because I think what we haven't, and maybe we can work better with the CRC. I'm thinking the planning board and CRC will also have a meeting next year to talk about the housing production plan and kind of discuss, right, how do we get some of these ideas, how do we bring them forward in a way that everyone feels like they understand it? So it's not like the planning board is talking about it all by themselves, and then all of a sudden it's like it's so new for everyone. It takes another 8 months to get people comfortable about it.
Yes.
So
If we develop them as
right,
important, fully descriptive schematic
right,
propositions,
right,
then A, they're easier to understand, I think, because the detail isn't there,
right,
and B, it's inviting the other entities, the council and particularly the CRC and public engagement to join in filling in the details, because we did spend so much time on the U drive overlay, and
right,
in retrospect, probably we we could have sent it to the council earlier than we did.
right, right.
So,
Yeah,
have
no,
you
I
got
like
anything to? You've been quiet. Do you want to chime in on any of this?
your mute. Fair.
yes, uh, yeah,
You don't have to, but I just
I,
was.
the, North Amherst one, I vividly remember that, I was on the planning board at that time and, the,
You mean
uh,
the Barkowski Meadows thing?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and, we we had a developer that was willing to pay to extend out of his own pocket to extend the sewer all the way down there. Uh, but uh, the people in North Amherst strongly opposed it, and it failed in town meeting finally. Uh,
Oh, you're not talking about Barkowski Meadows, then you're talking about something else.
yeah, it's on the it's the one. There's a solar array on part of it now, as I
Oh,
recall.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah, uh, but yeah, I think probably the best way to approach this is what Nate was talking about with a limited overlay.
Hmm. Nate, you're muted.
Yeah, as you were talking with, I was on Google,
Okay.
Street View and looking at, right, what you mentioned in terms of village homes. I feel like it's something like, oh yeah, I know that, and I love the idea of like the pocket parks, and so yeah, I do think if we had said we'd investigate 40Y and perhaps we glean things from it and we try to come up with a right, what if we want to call it like a cottage subdivision, but some something that we can um there's a few, even like the Maplewood property, maybe off Route 9, Belchertown Road. But what are there some, a few that we could look at, and then there's the PRP. So I think those are some really interesting ideas. I had said I would work on the North Amherst overlay too, and I want to start getting kind of fleshing out that the framework there. And I still think it's I think it's a nice place for it. There'll probably be a lot of questions, but I think we could, it's a different kind of development, right? That's a different kind of development method. We're looking at an idea concept there, but and so we have these different things moving.
Hmm.
Um, like I mentioned last night, some of the other things staff is looking at are trying to, um, some of them are procedural in the bylaw. So even right now, the bylaw has like four terms for the permit granting authority. Sometimes we say zoning board, sometimes we say planning board, sometimes we say permit granting board or permit granting authority. And at one point we had changed it, but we never really cleaned up the bylaw. And
Yeah.
when the ADU piece was going through, some of the council CRC members asked and said, well, why is it even within one section we have different references and they have different meanings. They're defined in the bylaw, but it's like, oh, even changing that could be useful. And it's, it doesn't have to, it's not necessarily,
That doesn't rise to the level of being interesting to us, I don't think.
no, it doesn't, but it's
Yeah.
something that staff, deals with because depending on what part of the bylaw, it can't be administratively approved or referred to the building commissioner. It has to go to a public hearing to the zoning
Yeah.
board or planning board. And so it's like, oh, like kind of Jesse's been asking, why does the planning, why are some of these things coming to hearing if they seem, you know, not unnecessarily complicated? And it's like, oh, well, the way the bylaw is written, it has to. So
Yeah.
yeah, not interested,
Okay.
right? I don't think this group would need to spend time with it, but it'd be something that we, I'd get to the
Yeah.
board.
Good. I guess Angus then, Fred, unless either of you feel that what you have to say is related to the current topic and you're about to change it or not.
I'm going to change it. So Fred, if you want to say something.
Well, only I was just going to ask Nate whether there was any progress getting a hold of the traffic engineering that was done on the main North Amherst intersection from Guilford.
No, and I made a note actually yesterday after a meeting to follow up with that again. Um,
All right,
th-
just
it's,
curious.
yeah, no, thanks for the reminder. Even at the planning board meeting last night, I made another note. I need to, because Jeff was asking actually, the new, director too, was like, oh, what's happening in North Amherst? Weren't there some studies done? And we found some stuff online, but it's, I think this might be something that has to be located physically, not, I don't, not anything electronic right now. So.
Okay. Angus, change the subject.
Yeah, so I was just looking over the, use classification and standards in the dimensional table, thinking about, I'm sorry to take us all the way back to PRP and OP, but um I have maybe a proposal to run by y'all that I wanted to kind of gauge interest. Looking at the commercial zone and then the office park and professional research park, they're real similar. There's like a few uses that are allowed in commercial that are not allowed in the other two, and a few uses in the other two that are not allowed in commercial. The dimensional standards are also not that different. And we're also thinking of trying to um, allow housing in the commercial zone. So I guess the proposal that I have that I could look into and bring back to the group for larger discussion is to kind of do a study of the classification and use table and the dimensional regulations table to see what it would require if we were to just rezone the current PRP and OP sites as commercial and possibly change a little bit of what's allowed in the commercial to allow for some of the uses that we're thinking about. And Nate, I know that you're like working with or you're planning to work with this consultant to talk about the commercial zone on College Street, right?
Right. And I think right now, um, some of the limiting factors in commercial are the additional lot area per family per unit, and then how
Yep.
we restrict the number of units in a mixed use building in commercial. So, there's some details within the use chart and probably elsewhere that would need to be changed, but I understand what you're saying.
So
Angus. So yeah, I
basically, Angus, you're asking whether they would be whether those three zones could be consolidated into
consolidated.
one.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which would still again retain all of the options that are currently allowed in PRP and OP, while essentially opening up those parcels and the two commercial parcels I think there's two, maybe. Maybe there's three
Yeah, I mean, I'm not,
to more options.
I'm not going to say no, don't do some research there. I think it is interesting to have a comparison of the uses and the dimensional standards and say, okay, what makes them so different? And is there a way to allow what we want, what's already allowed and continue it with maybe some extra? Um, and so, yeah, I think, it's probably, I think, Jeff and the planning department and others would appreciate that kind of analysis. And I think the consultant for East Amherst, the idea was maybe not just the commercial, but a bigger area and say, okay, what does the zoning allow and doesn't allow? And then if we wanted to increase density or have a different kind of development, what's necessary? And, we're looking at a 40R possibly, right? In East Amherst has been mentioned. And right now there's not a lot of um, incentive to redevelop in commercial because of some of these standards don't allow the density to make it worthwhile. So, there's not a lot of incentive. A 40R would, is an overlay, but the incentive would be, okay, well, there's no more, we have a reduced lot area requirement or we have greater height. And so the idea is that the underlying zoning is actually doesn't incentivize development, but then the 40R does. And so when we looked at a 40R downtown, one of the reasons I think it didn't move forward enough is that our downtown zoning and the BG is really generous. And so there wasn't really a lot of incentive to use the 40R because you could already get 5 stories and pretty big build out. So, you know, it, I think it's worth looking at. Staff has mentioned the same thing, the commercial zones. There's some uses there. There's a few of those in town, but is say the East Amherst or the North Amherst commercial zone, could that be changed a little bit? Um, I think it'd be interesting to see to me kind of what those differences are between PRP, OP, and COM, and is it worth keeping those distinctions or could they be combined somehow?
So could I ask a clarifying question, Nate?
Right?
Do y'all have like a Microsoft Word version of
Of
the bylaw or
yes,
specifically of the dimensional
yep,
table you do?
yep.
Is that do we have access to that?
I can email it to you, Angus. It gets every chart is its own document and
Okay.
every section of the zoning bylaw is its own section. So it's not like it's one kind of smart document with
Yeah.
headers and footers. It's really just, but I can send that to you for manipulation and
Yeah, that'd be
uh,
helpful because otherwise it's
right.
gonna get real ugly if I'm doing this like on a PDF.
Sure. Could you email me actually what sections you'd want or what you'd like to see, and then I can respond. That way it's easy
I
for
can.
me. Yep.
Yep. I mean, I don't want to derail, like, but as we're sitting here talking about different options and like looking at as I was looking at those three districts, it's like that's at least one option maybe for thinking about this, and also thinking I guess about that College Street strip. Like, would that make more sense as BG? I mean, like what you're describing, like
Right.
why a 40R doesn't make sense downtown. It's like, well, what if we just extend BG down College Street? But that's beyond maybe what we're doing. It is beyond what we're doing. Let me rephrase.
Well, the way it is and it isn't. I think they're like complementary ideas. So some of it to me is like looking at, okay, how can we have compact residential development in some areas in town, and how then do we have multi-unit or mixed-use development along busy streets and village centers? And so, you know, it'd be nice to have proposals that, or be thinking about some of these strategies, in parallel fashion, so that
Yeah.
maybe they don't all move forward to a zoning amendment, but the housing and zoning subcommittee is thinking about it, and the planning board is thinking about it, and we keep it on the list, right? So maybe some of these ideas don't get moved forward, but it's things I'd like to revisit. So like this idea of like I'll call it the cottage subdivision is something that might take a little time to explore. We'd have to change our subdivision regs in terms of roadway widths, but I think it's probably worthwhile to do that. So that you could take a 20 acre lot instead of getting just some flag lots, you could actually get a nice looking development, that's still fee simple. Right now, our zoning doesn't really, it doesn't accommodate that very well. So, yeah.
Um, it's we've been going an hour or so. Have we got what we want from this meeting?
Yeah, I think the one thing, the planning board, we haven't talked about, maybe that, at the at this next subcommittee meeting would be, and Bruce, I know you had talked to maybe Kitty and Darcy after the hearings, are
Yes.
there um, ideas or elements from those petitions that we'd add to the list? I think I've actually added a few, but, you know, are there other ones that we'd want to just discuss and say, okay, these are things that are worth looking into? Like, I don't, for instance, I don't,
Mm.
student home definition, I don't really know, but minimum distancing or some other kind of regulatory framework. Um,
Well, you can't do minimum distancing without a student home definition. That's the
I know,
fundamental building block upon which you can build that
right?
idea. I think what I was going to say, I hinted at last night, but didn't get into, and which I've sent to Jesse, and is my piece that I put together. What I've done following that hearing where we had Kitty and Darcy with their two the citizen petitions that they put forward, where Jesse and I subsequently met with them, where I think they've essentially rekindled the interest that I have in pursuing the conversations that I had began years ago. What I've done uh, is I've written a piece which might be about 3 or 4 pages long, which is essentially trying to understand. I've expanded the thinking about the three basic options that towns like Amherst seem to be that are available to us, and looked at that in more detail, and and tried to um, help us understand, help me and others perhaps understand is of these three strategic approaches, whether it's pushing the university to do more, whether it's spreading the student housing throughout the town in smaller existing or new buildings, or whether it's doing as we're trying to do at North Amherst with the overlay to a consolidated, dense accommodation close to campus. Looking at each of those solution concepts and trying to writing a piece about the pros and cons, or saying what each is, um, evaluating each in terms of the pros and cons of each, and so that we can have somewhat of a. I'd like to get my thinking around that, and it also could be, a piece that the Bulletin or Gazette might choose to publish. Um, but mostly I that conversation that Kitty and Darcy opened, at least for me, and is an expansion of the way in which we've been thinking, because and I expressed this in the meeting, and I think that various people, councillors and so forth, have somewhat apparently inclined to castigate me for saying how I was distressed that we were plowing new ground and so forth. Um, but but in some respects, yes, we were. That conversation has caused me to want to um, uh, rethink that notion of the ground that I'm thinking we're plowing. So I wanted to spend a little bit more time and be able to make the case, strengthen the case of whichever of those three approaches we are either supporting or not supporting, and be defensible, deliberate, open, and clear, and hopefully convincing in respect of each of those, because there are arguments for and against each of those three approaches, and I don't think and they're fundamentally different, and different towns across the country are approaching, saying, well, we're choosing one or other of those three as their preferred option, and maybe they're shifting. We don't know that just because they were committed in 2018 that they're still committed in 2026. And so we're going to go back and see if we can figure that out, and so forth. But I've put some time over the past couple of weeks into writing this up, and I want to review it with Jesse first, and then I'll send it. So I think that is the outwash, the principal outwash from my point of view about Kitty and Darcy's engagement. I think ultimately it's probably very constructive, and if for no other reason than that we've got them um, understand their energies and what they know and what they don't. I also had a long-ish, not long, but 10 minutes conversation with Rolf Karlstrom, who lives on Fearing, with Paige Wilder, the two of them together. And they have spent a lot of time. I think they were deeply engaged in the UTAC. Was that what Doug was talking about last night? I think they were deeply engaged in those initiatives, and were distressed to see that what came out of it was the consolidated construction of housing right in their backyard, rather than in other places that the conversations seem to indicate that it could have happened. So they've got very got informed and developed opinions about what's the right way to go. And I think I also would like to invite Carl to come and talk to us about the strength of his convictions about which is the right and which is not the right way to go about this, because he's over the years they've thought about it a lot, and they may even have been categorized as troublemakers in some quarters, I suppose, but they're they're the Pete Seeger type of troublemaker. They're people who've got big hearts and come to it with a constructive approach, and have, for whatever reason, come down on a side that isn't perhaps widely shared. We don't know. But I'd like to hear Carl respond, Rolf respond comprehensively to this piece that I'm writing, because I'd like to know what he thinks is right, what he thinks is not right, and why. I think that would be helpful. And I think it might be helpful to us as a subcommittee to hear, to participate in that conversation. Angus?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great ideas there, Bruce, and I think we should be hearing from these people. I think there was it's clear there was a lot of deep appreciation for the event that y'all did in North Amherst around the overlay,
Yeah.
among the community, and a feeling that the planning board has not done that kind of outreach in the past. At least based on the comments that I saw on different, both to us directly, and then also on reporting about the event. And that's, I think, really great. And so I just wanted to, commend y'all for that idea, for executing it, for listening. I think the only thing that I would kind of say as a note of caution is that I don't think that these people necessarily hold this position, but this is just something that I've picked up within the community. In addition to the comment I made last night about there seem to be some voices who are really treating UMass students as
Problems.
as not only problems, but also using a language that's particularly hostile. I think I've also been hearing things in the community around, UMass just needs to solve this problem. And I think I love your idea, Bruce, of getting UMass more involved in the conversation, and we should be applying pressure where we can, and talking constructively with them about how we can work together to push things. I don't think UMass is going to solve this problem by itself, and I think it's unlikely the town is going to either, which is why it's a good idea to think of a both and strategy as partners. But I think there's some of the frustration that I have, and I guess it's embodied in the citizen petitions themselves. One was a
Yeah.
moratorium on building,
Yep.
and the other was a focus on trying to preserve, family neighborhoods, as opposed to turning them into student rentals. And I'm sympathetic to that second one. The first one, I'm not sympathetic to. And I think that that kind of a moratorium, the idea of limiting building across town as a solution to these problems is, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time entertaining those kinds of conversations. That's my only point of caution. I think we should
Yeah.
hear from these people, and think with them about how to push these different strategies. But there's a fourth strategy, kind of, that you didn't outline, Bruce. That's kind of
Yep.
the, get UMass to solve the problem, basically, and we don't need to build anything. And that
Well, that's the
I
first
don't support.
strategy.
I guess so. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
they're
It's
not.
not that they should do. The strategy isn't the strategy is the strategy. The version of that strategy which would be the solution is that strategy number one is the only one that we pursue. That so it's
Yeah,
not a
yeah,
fourth one. The fourth one is
gotcha.
a solution, not a strategy.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and I agree, and I also, I don't of the two positions that we discussed that were presented to us, the one that was by far the most useful, the only one that was useful to me was the one on the minimum distancing, which was partially thought out. We picked up all sorts of various of us had parts of it that we found severely problematic, as well as other parts we could understand and so forth. But the moratorium part, I agree. I didn't think that was is going to be a useful solution concept to anything you care about. Um, uh, so I'm going to, as I said, I've already got ideas on how I want to reconstruct this thing that I've written. I'm going to share it and discuss it with Jesse because I want to tunnel in with one because I think it'd be more useful before I share it with all of you because I want to just get it into a good solid, or what I think is a good solid useful place, and then I'll be very much interested in seeing whether you all think this is useful, and whether it's helpful. But I want to be able to approach this North Amherst proposition from a very broad base introduction, which says, here's 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 the big picture, and here's how our thinking have got us to the proposition that we're discussing in North Amherst. It didn't come out of nowhere. It's not selectively applied. It's and I would like to know, or like to know as best as possible, that this big picture analysis brought down is compelling, defensible, accurate, and fully explained. And that's where you all will, I hope, come in to add and improve and so forth. Nate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think Bruce, having that your document and to me, it also, I'm thinking, the idea of having strategies and looking at this as like a, challenge where you're trying to solve, to me also, I hope it can change the language being used around the housing piece. So whether it's separating
Yes.
out the students or not, but to me, it's like, oh, this is a kind of a fun challenge, right? This is a fun planning challenge. And so the language, if we frame it differently and we have some of these supporting documents and ideas, then the, the kind of the framework for the conversation might be a little different. And so I like that approach. And so, whether, I just think that's to change that a little bit, because when the council discussed the petitions again the other week, some of the language it was kind of harsh. And I don't think I think it's totally unintended. And I don't, I really don't think that there's animosity towards, students. I think it's, how, like Doug was saying, there's certain, certain factors and things, but I just, I think having a different kind of language is really helpful. So, kind of these ideas and moving forward with that, like, okay, here's how we want to move forward together, say with the university or with other partners, and here are some strategies. And so it's to me more about the strategy and these ideas and not Um, and we're focusing on that, not like, oh, just the
Okay.
students. It's like, oh, here are some housing ideas. Like, let's move the housing idea forward. So
Hmm.
I'm glad, we can have all this backup information. We can synthesize it and have a nice kind of, right, like a nice framework for the discussion.
Hmm. Well, I think we should be about done. We're
Yeah.
coming up to an hour and a half, or at least an hour and 20 minutes. Um, as far as notes of this meeting is concerned, is there some automatic generated? I don't know how Jesse has been doing it, but I think he'd had AI operating.
Yeah,
Um,
this is being recorded. I can work with Jesse and get minutes out of this, so that's not a
okay,
problem.
good. Are we done?
I'm all set.
I was just gonna say one other thing, which is I'm gonna work on looking at that commercial OP PRP stuff, and I'll bring it to the next housing subcommittee to see if there's any legs there. And I'll try to send it ahead of time. That way people have a chance to see what it might take to consolidate those zones and if that's a worthwhile thing.
Good. And I'm interested in this 40Y, no, not what we're going to call it, cottage style subdivision idea. So but I've got my other piece. I'm focused first of all on the North Amherst question, and then I would probably seek to be interested in thinking through a solid conceptual version of that idea that uh, we could send on to the council. Okay.
Great.
Nice to see you all. Happy
Thanks.
holidays. And whenever, I think we have scheduled the next meeting. I just don't know when it is.
Yeah, I think right now on the calendar it's January 15th, so it's a
January
little bit of
15th.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
See you later. Thanks.
Bye bye.